8:42 in the evening, April 25th, Washington, District of Columbia. The Washington Hilton ballroom erupted in absolute terrifying chaos. Gunfire shattered the formal atmosphere of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Secret Service agents swarmed the main stage, violently tackling President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. They dragged the leaders of the free world through emergency evacuation routes while a bleeding federal agent collapsed on the polished floor. The shooter was neutralized by counter-sniper teams within seconds, but the geopolitical nightmare was just beginning. They found a handwritten letter on the gunman. It detailed a systematic, calculated plan to assassinate the president and his entire senior cabinet. But here is what nobody tells you about that night. That single gunshot did not just threaten a sitting president. It acted as the starting pistol for the most aggressive, ruthless, and terrifying internal purge in the history of the United States government. While the world watched the flashing police lights in the Capitol, the real massacre began inside the Pentagon. Run the numbers with me. The United States military commands a budget approaching $900 billion. We operate 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. We deploy stealth fighters that cost $100 million a copy. But none of that steel matters if the chain of command is fractured. For every single dollar American taxpayers spend to project power across the globe, the current administration is spending political capital to tear that exact power structure down from the inside. 38 minutes. That is all it takes for an Iranian ballistic missile to reach American bases in the Middle East. 38 minutes of warning. But how do you respond to a crisis when the generals who are supposed to give the orders have already been fired? You are looking at a 25-to-1 disadvantage in political stability compared to our adversaries. And that was the moment everything changed. On April 22nd, the axe fell on the United States Navy. President Trump abruptly fired Secretary of the Navy John Phelan amid a massive, sweeping restructuring of military leadership. This was not a standard political resignation. This was a brutal, unceremonious decapitation of the man responsible for the largest maritime force on the planet. Phelan oversaw 340,000 active duty sailors. He controlled a budget that builds $13 billion Ford-class supercarriers. He managed the deployment of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers currently defending international shipping lanes. But he was gone in an instant. Why? Because the administration is no longer fighting a war against foreign adversaries. They are fighting a war against their own officers. What they did not know was that the purge was about to accelerate. What happened next shocked the Pentagon to its core. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had already drawn up a hit list. Over the past year, Hegseth has ruthlessly fired or sidelined more than 24 generals and admirals, 24 flag officers, decades of combat experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the South China Sea completely wiped out in a partisan bloodbath. The climax of this military slaughter came on April 3rd, when the administration dismissed Army Chief of Staff General Randy George, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army. Gone. The man responsible for preparing American ground forces for a potential land war in Eastern Europe was removed from his post. The reason? Military commanders were reportedly refusing to strike black and female officers from promotion lists. They were defending diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. And for that, they were stripped of their command. This is not a restructuring. This is a hostile takeover of the armed forces. But look closer at the ideological war. April 23rd. The purge spread from the civilian leadership directly into the military press. The Pentagon terminated Jacqueline Smith, the independent ombudsman for Stars and Stripes, the official military newspaper. The accusation: the White House claimed the publication had become too woke. Think about that for a second. While Chinese shipyards are pumping out 3 advanced destroyers every single month, the United States Department of Defense is spending its time firing journalists over political grievances. The internal focus is blinding the military to the external threat. But the civilian casualties were just the collateral damage. The real target was the technological future of the nation. On April 24th, the administration launched a devastating strike against the intellectual core of the American defense apparatus. President Trump abruptly terminated all 22 members of the National Science Board. This is the independent advisory body for the National Science Foundation. These are the minds that guide billions of dollars in research for quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and advanced hypersonics. The very technologies we need to stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Fired, all of them, in a single day. The brain trust of the American military-industrial complex was gutted. The development of the AGM-183 hypersonic weapon relies on this fundamental research. By firing these scientists, the administration just handed the technological edge directly to Beijing. And that is when the real panic began. Following the assassination attempt on April 25th, the rhetoric reached an absolute boiling point. On April 28th, First Lady Melania Trump publicly demanded the immediate firing of ABC television host Jimmy Kimmel. She explicitly accused him of utilizing hateful and violent rhetoric that incited the shooting. The administration was no longer just purging the military. They were coming for the media elite. And the media elite panicked. The threat was clear. If you speak against the regime, you will be held responsible for the violence in the streets. But here's what nobody tells you. The media takeover was already happening behind closed doors. Following a private closed-door dinner with President Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth, conservative media powerhouse Barry Weiss began planning immediate sweeping layoffs and a total ideological overhaul at CBS News and their flagship program, 60 Minutes. The message was clear: fall in line or be destroyed. The administration is systematically dismantling independent journalism while simultaneously decapitating the military. But the threats were not just financial. They were existential. Federal Communications Commission Chairman Brendan Carr took the podium and delivered an unprecedented threat. He warned that the broadcast licenses of local television stations could be revoked entirely. The crime: their critical coverage of the ongoing bloody war with Iran. The administration was aligning its political crosshairs with the media failure to support the war effort. If you question the commander-in-chief, you lose your network. It is that simple. And this brings us to the most dangerous geopolitical crisis of our lifetime: the war with Iran. The United States Navy has deployed massive carrier strike groups to the Persian Gulf. Thousands of American sailors are currently floating in the crosshairs of Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles. Each SM-6 interceptor in their vertical launch tubes costs $4.3 million. Each Iranian drone costs $20,000. For every dollar the enemy spends, American taxpayers spend $215 to defend. But no amount of money can buy strategic coherence when the government is collapsing at home. President Trump recently took to national television and threatened to completely wipe out Iranian civilization. A nuclear threat, an apocalyptic promise. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps heard that message loud and clear. They know they cannot defeat the United States Navy in a fair fight, but they also know they might not have to. Why? Because the American political right is eating itself alive. In a shocking twist that nobody saw coming, the president turned his fury on his own loyalists. He publicly attacked former conservative media allies Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly. He labeled them low-IQ nut jobs after they dared to criticize his erratic military strategies. The conservative coalition is shattering, and that was the moment the unthinkable happened. Following the threat to annihilate Iran, far-right influencers and former hardcore political allies turned against the president. Candace Owens and Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene publicly called for Trump to be removed from office via the 25th Amendment. Let that sink in. The very people who built the MAGA movement are now demanding its leader be stripped of his power before he triggers World War III. The republic is fracturing. Civil unrest is no longer a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. The command structure is broken. The adversaries are watching. What happens when the next missile flies? Run the numbers again. 5,000 American sailors aboard a single Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. They rely on clear, concise, and stable orders from the Pentagon to survive in hostile waters. When the Secretary of the Navy is fired without warning, that stability evaporates. When the Army Chief of Staff is dismissed over political disputes, the entire logistics chain shudders. The men and women in the Combat Information Center do not care about television ratings or broadcast licenses. They care about incoming radar tracks. But the politicians in Washington are treating the military like a reality television cast, and the world is taking notes. Russian intelligence operatives are flooding social media with amplified reports of the internal chaos. Chinese maritime militia vessels are pushing harder against Philippine Coast Guard ships in the South China Sea because they know Washington is distracted. They see a nation that is bleeding itself dry over cable news disputes while the global order hangs by a thread. But look closer at the timing of these events. April 3rd, April 22nd, April 23rd, April 24th, April 25th, April 28th. This is not random. This is a compressed timeline of institutional collapse. In less than 30 days, the United States saw its top military commanders purged, its leading scientific minds fired, its media threatened with state control, and its executive branch physically attacked by a gunman. You are witnessing the real-time stress testing of the American Republic, and the warning lights on the dashboard are flashing red. The demand to fire Jimmy Kimmel was not just about a late-night comedy monologue. It was a test of compliance. The threat to revoke FCC licenses was not just about Iran war coverage. It was a demonstration of absolute executive authority. The administration is building a fortress around itself, and they are willing to burn down the Pentagon, the press, and the scientific community to secure the perimeter. But here is the fatal flaw in that strategy. A fortress requires defenders. And by firing 24 generals and admirals, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has alienated the very officer corps needed to maintain order. When Marjorie Taylor Greene and Candace Owens invoke the 25th Amendment, they are not just expressing political disagreement. They are signaling to the base that the commander-in-chief is no longer fit to control the nuclear arsenal. This is a constitutional crisis masquerading as a media circus. Think about the psychological impact on a young lieutenant sitting in a missile silo in North Dakota. They are watching their ultimate superiors tear each other apart on national television. They are watching the president call his own former supporters low IQ nut jobs. They are watching the First Lady demand the censorship of comedians, while the Navy lacks a confirmed secretary. This is how empires fall. Not from a massive external invasion, but from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. The Iranian leadership in Tehran does not need to launch a massive strike against the homeland. They just need to wait. They need to let the internal friction generate enough heat to melt the steel of American resolve. The purges, the firings, the threats, the violence. It all compounds. Every time a general is fired, years of strategic institutional knowledge vanish. Every time a scientist is terminated, a future weapons program is delayed. Every time a journalist is silenced, the truth becomes slightly harder to find. And in the fog of a potential global war, the truth is the only thing that keeps the missiles in their silos. We are standing on the precipice of an unprecedented domestic conflict. The media elite are in a state of absolute panic because they realize the old rules of engagement no longer apply. The military elite are paralyzed because their colleagues are being marched to the professional guillotine. And the civilian population is bracing for the inevitable spillover into the streets. The Washington Hilton shooting was the spark. The military purges are the fuel. And the impending war with Iran is the match. We have 24 flag officers gone, 22 top scientists removed, 1 Secretary of the Navy fired, 1 Army Chief of Staff dismissed, 1 independent military ombudsman terminated, and 1 sitting president threatening to wipe out an entire civilization while his own allies plot his constitutional removal. The math of danger has never been clearer. The United States is currently its own worst enemy. The ultimate question is no longer whether we can defeat China or Russia or Iran. The ultimate question is whether we can survive ourselves long enough to even make it to the battlefield. And as the carrier strike groups patrol the dark waters of the Persian Gulf waiting for orders from a fractured command structure, the world holds its breath. Because the next shot fired might not come from an Iranian drone. It might come from inside the house. Are you prepared for what comes next? The truth is, preparation goes far beyond stockpiling supplies or monitoring the 24-hour news cycle. It requires a fundamental understanding of how fragile our interconnected systems truly are. When the electrical grids fail, when the global supply chains snap under the pressure of localized conflicts, the illusion of safety will evaporate overnight. We have built a civilization reliant on constant stability, yet we are actively dismantling the pillars that hold it up. Look at the financial markets, jittery with every whispered rumor of a preemptive strike. Look at the cyber domain, where silent skirmishes are already crippling infrastructure without a single physical bullet being fired. This invisible war is the precursor to the kinetic nightmare we are desperately trying to avoid. Every citizen must now become a geopolitical analyst, deciphering the propaganda and reading between the lines of official statements. The storm is no longer gathering on the distant horizon. It is already breaking against our shores. History does not forgive those who choose willful ignorance over hard truths. The clock is ticking. We must wake up before it is far too late.